Welcome to the Indigo Podcast, an exploration of human flourishing at work and beyond. I'm Ben Barron of Indigo Anchor and Cleveland State University.
And I'm Chris Everett of Indigo Anchor. For more information, please visit us at www.indigopodcast.com. All right, so today we're going to talk about active shooters at work. Run, hide, fight, and more.
That's right. So we're going to talk about what is an active shooter and what you should do in an active shooter situation. We'll talk about roles for leaders and managers, and we'll talk about some considerations for HR departments and the rest of the organization. And, you know, we get it that this is not a fun topic to talk about or even to think about. But, you know, not thinking about it can really cost you. This is a very low probability type of incident that could happen in the workplace, somewhere where you are, but the outcomes are of the highest stakes. So I suppose it's important for us to discuss, and we have some experience dealing with the training and the types of methods that should be used in these types of situations. So let's start off with that, Chris, and talk a little bit about what is an active shooter and what you should do in an active shooter situation. What have been some of your own experiences in terms of training and experience in this area?
Yeah, so first of all, Ben was about to be an active shooter on this episode due to technical difficulties that we've now surmounted. Second of all, you'll have to excuse the gallows humor because Ben and I come from a military background, and that just kind of goes on with some of this stuff, you know. Filson needs to, I don't know, take his jacket while he's running from an active shooter. So if you get some of that humor, please give us a pass or send us a nasty email. It's either one is fine. But an active shooter is somebody with a loaded weapon that's actually shooting out in public, right? At a work environment, God forbid, a school, sporting event, that kind of thing.
Yeah, but you've had some experience in the military, right? Give us your street cred.
Well, I mean, I'm an infantry officer for, 7.5 years. And, we have, I was in the Tennessee National Guard before I moved out to Utah, and we did have a shooter that came and shot up some of our recruiters there, going from recruiting station to recruiting station, and even ended up at a Navy recruiting station, Ben, right? It
was actually the Reserve, Navy Reserve Center in Chattanooga was where most of it happened. So, yeah, so, you and I have both been in the military for a long time. We actually met in Afghanistan, as many of our listeners know, and we've all along that way had to do active shooter training, thinking about these types of issues. So in addition to our organizational involvement on the civilian side, we also have a fair amount of experience thinking about this and training for it in our military capacity. When we were in Afghanistan together back in 2013, one emerging issue that was really on the forefront of our minds happened to be the insider threat. And in that case, it was some Afghans whom we were training, whom we were advising, who had been either infiltrated or otherwise coerced by the bad guys, by the Taliban, to turn on us and shoot at their advisors, their NATO counterparts. And so because of that, we had to do even more training, and it was certainly a huge part of our approach in Afghanistan. So, it's something that you and I are probably unusually, I suppose, attuned to, given our experiences. But I think it's very important for us to maybe share some of that experience and share some of our perspective on this very important topic for people out there in organizations.
Yeah, it's just important to treat this as a fire drill or a tornado drill. This is something, especially for our, non-US listeners. I mean, you guys know that there is a metric ton of weapons in the United States. And
more than a metric ton.
Right. And civil unrest, like the numbskulls at the Capitol riot and different political things that are coming out in the workplace. So it's worth just thinking about taking some common sense approaches. Don't put too much emotional weight on this other than, hey, it's something you got to think about, like buckling up your safety belt when you get in the car.
Right. You can't ignore it. And we'll be referencing a really great document from the U.S. Department of Homeland Security as we go through this, because it outlines a number of key actions and ways of thinking that can really be helpful for you. And, so you can check that out. We have a link to it in the show notes. If you're not so inclined to read, obviously listen to us talk about it, because it has some great points in it, and we'll be going through those here as we go through the episode. So, let's go ahead and start, in terms of thinking about active shooter scenarios and what individuals should do when an active shooter is in your vicinity. And as we suggested in the title, the thing to remember is run, hide, fight. And it's in that order. So the first thing you got to do is evacuate. Tell us more, Chris.
Yeah. And I hear this from the gun nuts that I socialize some of those Facebook groups with gun owners and stuff like that. And they'll talk, well, this is where I'm going to go stand and fight. Well, here's the thing that's the darndest thing about guns is somebody does not have to have experience to accidentally kill the most experienced person. You can be the most crack shot, but that guy just squeezes off a round without even aiming, and it hits you, and it's game over for you. There's no respawn like a video game. So
yeah,
running.
This is not the movies. This is not a video game. Get out of there.
Right. Run is the smartest. If you are the most experienced person, the answer is to run. You're
right.
not at your place of work. You're not on a military post that needs defending. Just get out of there. Grab people with you, right? Tell them, say, hey, Larry, there's a shooter. Let's go.
Mm-hmm. But at the same time, if Larry is insistent on staying, don't let that hamper you, right? So first of all, you got to have that escape route in mind, have a plan in mind. So be aware of your surroundings. When back in the day when I used to actually teach in person in my professor role, I'm sure we'll get back to that at some point. But I would always, whenever I was in a classroom, make note of where are my exits, how could I potentially escape if something were going down. And if something is happening, if you hear about it, if you start to hear maybe sounds like fireworks, maybe you hear people screaming and moving, maybe you get a report somehow, via social media or via some sort of announcement, then you want to get out of there as quickly as possible. Leave your stuff behind. This is just like when you're on an airplane and they say, don't take your carry-on if you're trying to get out of there. Leave your stuff there. Get out of there, and keep your hands visible while you're doing it. Why is that important?
Yeah. So, somebody's going to call some kind of response force, and they're going to show up probably in a group of 4 cops or something, and you don't want to look like one of the shooters. And one of the ways to do that is to put your hands up in the air and spread your fingers out as wide as possible.
Right.
If you see the police coming, or the response force coming from a certain direction, go ahead and follow behind that. They'll direct you if that's the wrong way to go, but generally they're coming in through a direction that's already been cleared of any kind of danger.
Right. So you want to follow the instructions of any police officers. Don't try to move anybody who's maybe wounded in your way. And when you are safe, then that's the time to call 911 if it's apparent that hasn't happened already. So first step is run. Evacuate the area. Now, if you can't run, if evacuation is not possible, your next option is to hide. So what kinds of hiding places should you be looking for?
Well, normally we think about 2 types of hiding. It's cover and concealment, right?
Yeah.
So concealment would be like the curtains,
Mm-hmm.
right? If that's all you got, that's better than nothing, right? But that's curtains not going to stop a bullet, right?
Right.
And so that's concealment. It's concealing you from view. Now, cover could actually take a bullet behind a metal desk, behind a super barricaded door or something. But you got to just, sometimes the terrain, be that a building or wherever, is going to constrain where you can hide. And you just want to take those kinds of things into mind and go for the better place. But that means think about the 3 or 4 places you'd hide in your organization if you had to, right? Ahead of time when you're not stressed out and, maybe being shot at.
Right. So you want to be obviously out of the potential active shooter's view. You want to be somewhere that ideally provides both that concealment and the cover, so could potentially provide protection if shots are fired in your direction. And also, you would ideally have a hiding spot that doesn't restrict your options for movement out of there. You can also, obviously lock the door, blockade the door with some heavy furniture. If your furniture doesn't move, then there are some options out there. There's actually some products that companies can buy and provide for their employees that can make the door, blockaded. And so, if you have that option, do that. But again, this is after after you've eliminated the run option. One sobering detail that I always remember from some of my training on active shooter scenarios comes from the Columbine shooting, which was a high school a long time ago now here in the United States, but it was a devastating shooting that happened in a high school in Colorado. And one thing that was so tragic about that situation is that many of the people who ended up dying were in the school library, and there were actually, I think, at least 2 exits from there. They were hiding rather than leaving, and we didn't have this kind of training back then. It wasn't something that was as salient to us, unfortunately, as it is today. But I'll always run. Then, if you can't do that, then you hide.
And here's the thing: shooting and killing people is not easy, like in the movies. Some numbskull that's come into your place of work is unlikely to be some SEAL-trained super sniper that can hit somebody at 300 yards with a 9mm pistol, right?
Right.
And so if you're running, and if you want to run, if somebody's directly behind you, run in a bit of a zigzag. It is hard to hit a moving target for the untrained individual. But if you are staying stuck in one spot and they're able to get up real close to you, well, you statistically, your odds aren't as good as if you're actively running. So that means getting outside and just hauling for it, do it.
Yeah.
It's going to be hard for somebody to hit a moving target.
That's right. Now, going back to that hiding place, a couple other things you want to think about is silencing your cell phone. You don't want to draw attention to where you are. Turn off any other kind of sources of noise that may be around you. If there's a radio or TV that's on, hide behind some large items. Remain quiet. If you can't evacuate or hide out, make sure you still try to remain calm. Dial 911 if possible. And then if you can't run or hide, and it really gets to the point of having to do something actively, that's when you fight. So it's run, hide, and as a last, I emphasize last resort, you can take some action against the active shooter.
Yeah. So, there's kind of thinking around active shooters. There's the thinking about it before 9/11, right? With the Twin Towers. And then after. Now, it wasn't that people weren't trained on active shooter stuff, because cops and SWAT teams respond and they had a body of knowledge. But if you're on a plane anymore and somebody stands up with a gun or a box cutter or something like that, there's no longer will people just sit and say, well, I guess I'll see how this develops. That was the old thinking. Now that we got to bum rush this guy. And if I die doing it, then the next guy, we got to go until we eliminate this threat to our lives. It's the same thing. So if you can't run, you can't hide, you're going to have to go bananas and fight. And that means there's no 20% effort here for you. Mm-hmm. You may even take a bullet on the route to subduing that person, right? And so you want to act as aggressively as possible. Loud noises, screaming, throw stuff. You got that freaking sling line stapler sitting there on your desk while Milton, you're going to throw that, buddy, right?
Yeah, no, I exactly. You mentioned earlier that it is much harder in reality than in the movies or in a video game to actually hit anything, even if it's moving or even if it's stationary, right? With a weapon, it's extremely hard if that target is, throwing things at you, is making noise, and all those types of actions. So those are some things you absolutely can do. I remember back from some of my training on this. Actually, this goes back to some of my just training on the use of deadly force. And there's something, I believe it's called the 21-foot rule, right? Which is where if somebody is about 21 feet away from you and you have a weapon and it's maybe in a holster, they can probably get to you before you can even pull that weapon, right? Don't underestimate your ability to disrupt what's going on. And, charging at somebody, throwing something, if that's your last resort, don't just sit there passively. You got to fight.
Yeah, so we have this thing, and it's a decision making, kind of model called the OODA loop,
Hmm.
right? And so if you know that that person's coming in, you know the lay of the room and the land, that person doesn't. So for him to see you, and OODA stands for OODA, right? Observe, orient, decide, act. So if that shooter's coming in that room, he's going to have to, and you start screaming and running at him, he's going to one, observe, well, what's going on,
Mm-hmm.
right? And orient towards you to, okay, I need to do something about this. He's going to have to decide to pull out his weapon or shoot. And I guarantee you, most people could be more on target throwing that big, heavy stapler than people can engage with a pistol or, in some cases, a rifle, right? So observe, orient, decide, and then that guy's going to have to act by pulling the trigger. Now, he may just act by just start squeezing rounds off the minute you start yelling. But that's fine. That still gives you time because he's not observing and oriented in your direction.
That's well said. So that's kind of what you should do at a basic level as an individual. Keep those things in mind. Run, hide, fight. But we also said that this is run, hide, fight, and more. There's other things that you need to be thinking about. And now we're kind of moving on from the individual level to thinking a little bit more about your roles as a leader, as a manager in an organization. And there are a number of things that you can do here. Some of this has to do with just your position in the organization, but also in terms of things that perhaps you could train the rest of your organization on, or at least have as discussion points. So, one thing to remember is that, how you respond when law enforcement gets there. First of all, these things normally start and end within about, 5, 10, 15 minutes. Um, Something will happen pretty soon that will resolve this. Now, there's a lot that can happen in that time period, of course, but police officers normally, arrive in teams to something like this, maybe teams of 4. They oftentimes are going to be wearing some sort of uniform, and maybe they'll have other kinds of tactical equipment on them. They may not look exactly like the regular cop that you would see on the street because they may have a rifle with them, other types of protective equipment. They might use some tear gas or pepper spray to control the situation, which if that get, I have been both tear gassed and pepper sprayed as part of my military training, and neither one are enjoyable. So you're going to have to stay calm there. Officers might be shouting, and they may even push you or others to the ground. So they're not concerned first and foremost about your happiness in that moment. They are concerned and focused most expressly on eliminating the threat.
Right. And so just be aware that regular numbskulls have this tactical armor and stuff too.
That's true.
Right? So be looking for signs, are they clean cut? You know, Definitely, oh, look, this is not Filson from accounting, right? You
Hmm.
know, these guys, be aware, they'll generally identify themselves, if they're smart, but like we've seen cases where, like up in Oregon, where we had legitimate policing forces in unmarked vans and no identification on them. So, like, that's just be watching for some of that stuff. Now, if somebody's coming in to enter and clear a building, they're generally going to have like a police badge, but you can buy those at the Army thrift store, right? So you just be looking for cues more than do they have police and how do they look before you just go running into their arms, okay?
Yeah. Oh, and you should run into their arms anyway, right? You should stay calm. As soon as you get the sense that this is actually are police officers, more than likely, then put down anything that's in your hands. Keep your hands visible at all times because they're trying to figure out where the threat is, and you don't want them to think that it's you. You don't need to point, scream, or yell. They're trying to figure things out, and they probably already have an idea of what's going on. Don't stop them to try to ask for help or directions. Just get out of there. Get out of there from the direction that they're coming in. Because as you mentioned earlier, Chris, they're going to be coming in from a direction that's already deemed to be relatively
Cleared.
safe. Yeah, it's cleared. So do that
And
now.
don't scream, because
Right.
that lets the shooter know where you are, right?
True.
And if you're screaming, they can't listen and maintain situational awareness of which way they need to orient themselves to protect you as you run out.
Yeah, yeah. Now, once you get to a place, maybe it's outside of the building, you'll probably know what this place looks like. There'll be things will be a little bit calmer. There'll be people out there. Maybe there's someone trying to get information, either law enforcement or a 911 operator if you're on the phone with 911. If you know the location of the active shooter, obviously you tell them. Try to describe any physical description you may have. If there's more than one, obviously report that if there's more than one shooter. If there's any kinds of types of weapons, if there's, maybe if you have some information about the number of potential victims, also share that.
Yeah, and it's simple stuff like, hey, I saw two guys. One had a pistol and the other guy had a rifle,
Hmm.
right? That just lets them know what, you just in that moment, you want any information that can help you, because this is what the police are doing. We got to get people out, and then we got to go neutralize or
Yeah.
contain what's going on here. And they're on 100,000 times alert to try to be aware of every little piece. So anything you can help feed them to help them is good. It's a positive.
Yeah. And again, don't be surprised that those first law enforcement officials on scene are not stopping to help victims. Their job is to neutralize a threat. So they're going to be moving in quickly and dealing with that. Now, they will be followed by additional law enforcement and emergency medical technicians and so forth to help those people. So that is happening. They're not forgetting about these people. Help is on the way in that type of scenario. Most likely, if you do reach a kind of a safe point, you're probably going to be held in that area. They probably don't want you to leave right away until the situation's under control. They may, if you're a witness, they will ask you questions and, of course, be helpful and don't leave until they tell you you can go. So those are some things I think are really helpful for us to keep in mind as leaders, as managers, and things to share perhaps with our staffs when we're doing this kind of training and going through this thought process with our people. So why don't we move now and talk a little bit about some considerations for human resource departments for the rest of the organization, and we have a bunch of different thoughts here. Again, we are pulling heavily from this document from the Department of Homeland Security. But let's talk a little bit about training your staff for an active shooter situation. What are some guidance points that we can share there?
Well, one of the things that is real simple is just talking about it at all. Like
Yeah.
that's a real that can buy you so much territory when you cover this. Oh, so talking about it at all, and then having a plan that is socialized with the people in your organization so people know what to do.
Yeah. So there are some components of an emergency action plan that the Department of Homeland Security outlines. And this would be something that you would create. Obviously, you do this before something happens. Don't wait until you would have liked to have had something like this. Create that emergency action plan, usually in coordination with your HR department. Maybe if you have some people who are focused on training, you want to have some of the people who are smart about the facility itself. Um, in on that conversation. Maybe it's your property manager, person who owns the facility. And, you could even involve local law enforcement or emergency responders in that plan. I had the opportunity many years ago to observe and be fairly close in the action of a large scale active shooter drill that we did at a university. And we had involvement. From top leadership of the university, set up an incident command center. We had people and this was all simulated, but it was a phenomenal training experience. Had emergency personnel from local areas, coordinating. We had representatives from local hospitals saying, how would we be reacting to these situations? It was very helpful. So come up with that plan. What does that look like for you and your organization?
Right. And part of that plan should be, now you have to have like fire escape stuff, right? And
Sure.
points, this way to the exit, this way to the exit. But one of the better practices is to have two signs for your floor, for each floor at every entrance that'll show the layout of the rooms on that building and make these Velcro attached to the wall.
Hmm.
So when you have a responder, when you have you have that four-man fighting force that's clearing rooms, they get to a new floor. They've never been in your building before because you just haven't run your exercise with them yet or whatever. They can just take that Velcro removable sign off and use it as a map to help them. Ooh, I know if I open this door, there's two other doors in this room. Or,
Hmm.
these are the kinds of things that can just help people that aren't used to it. Also, if you have a guest, they can, and there's active shooter, they can take one of those maps off the wall and, use it to find their way out.
Yeah, yeah. Other parts of your emergency action plan should also include what is your emergency notification system? How would you let people know what's going on? How might you notify people who are at remote locations within the premises, depending on kind of what your layout looks like? How would you notify local law enforcement, maybe local area hospitals? Having all that information in one place. I mean, this wouldn't necessarily take you that much time. If you had the right stakeholders in the room, you could probably figure this out in half a day and at least have some sort of good framework that then could be put out to your employees and help them stay safe in the event that something terrible like this happens. Now, moving beyond that, you could also do some actual training. So, what are some things that you might want to think about in terms of different pieces of that training?
Well, something that I see missed often in, say, mid-sized organizations, even on the fire and the tornado stuff, is the line leaders, managers, directors don't know. Like if you go, hey, how many people are on your team? If it's a small team, they'll be like 8. But
Hmm.
sometimes they have to stop and count.
Yeah.
And so if you got to go meet for a fire drill in the parking lot across the street, how do you know that everybody's got everybody? You can say, well, I need all leadership over here. Do you have accountability of everybody out of the building? We got everybody but Tom,
Yeah.
and we can't get him on his phone. I mean, this is just in the military, we do it all.
Yeah.
Personal accountability is so key. I just
Hmm.
don't see that intensity in the.
That I'm so glad you brought that up, Chris. That is an amazing point that really should be emphasized because you're right. In the military, we are very concerned about making sure we know who is where and do you have everybody, all of those types of items. In, civilian life, it's much less of an emphasis. I would argue that as a good supervisor, make sure that you know how many people are under your purview and their names. You also, with their permission, perhaps you may have company policies about this, or people may have different ideas about it. Even having their contact information and maybe even contact information for their next of kin, have that somewhere accessible. Having those types of that information as well as the knowledge is super helpful and really should be just kind of part of manager training. I think like just drilling that into people. Hey, these are your people, and you need to take care of them. You need to at least know who's on your team and how to get in touch with them.
Right. And just be careful. So, if you guys talk through your communication plan,
Mm,
because sometimes it's not appropriate for a line manager to go say, hey, yeah, I saw your husband bleeding out as we
yeah,
ran out of the
very true.
building, like in that moment, right? So talk about that, consult with your legal department on what it should be. But sometimes there can just be a, hey, Margaret's safe with us. Or, if you're at a place where she left her cell phone, or I mean, these kinds of things, just think through that kind of contact plan. And just it's personal accountability.
Hmm.
And so somehow be right because people come and go and it's hard for people, the most senior level person in your organization or over that building, to know that we have 465 people in our building today, and we have 460 here. We're missing 5. Like it
Right.
can be hard to get that, but you can help by having that structure and level of accountability.
Right. Some other things that you may want to incorporate into your training exercises, and again, I'm pulling from the guidance from the Department of Homeland Security, is, what do gunshots sound like? And you and I probably take that for granted that we know what it sounds like. And everyone thinks they know what it sounds like because they've seen movies. But oftentimes I think that it could be mistaken for fireworks. So oftentimes it's more of a popping sound, right? And keeping that in mind, that kind of training, how you might react, and actually having some drills, right? Who's going to call 911? How do you react when law enforcement arrives? And certainly training those things that we talked about earlier in the episode of run, hide, and fight in that order, so that everyone is aware of those different elements.
Yeah, the physical layout of offices anymore, they say barricade yourself. Well,
Hmm.
all these cubicles are screwed to the floor. And are you going to put that Herman Miller Aeron roller chair up against the wall? Hey, if you got one of those, you're out of good company. You should probably stick around, right? But you can't put a bunch of roller chairs. That's not. And so, like one of the Haven Lock, Haven Lock, Haven Lock,
Hmm.
and some other people have some solutions that deal with this. Now, but here's the thing, don't just go installing these willy-nillys. And this is more for my entrepreneur founders that are going to just, oh, we'll save $1 million and just do this ourselves. And you could make it to where people can get barricaded in and can't get out,
Mm.
right? So you should have somebody with a technical, tactical background, maybe even let your local police force come in and start talking about, okay, if we don't have good egress, right, in and out of this building, right, where should we have some strong points where people could hole up? Maybe we get some reinforced steel doors there. There's people that can come in, give you an assessment, and then go do the work if you want to save the bucks and not, pay a vendor to come change out your doors and that kind of stuff. Another key point is on those maps, don't just put the doors and the buildings. Also notate the windows that can be used as an exit should somebody need to crawl out a window.
Mm. Mm. Those are some great points. I think it also is important to think about this, and we could probably do a whole nother episode or episodes on just the topic of workplace violence. But you can't hurt your organization by fostering a respectful workplace, by being aware of some of the indications of that can lead to workplace violence and taking some good actions accordingly. So I think that's another thing just to keep in mind as you're thinking about this whole issue. I'd like to turn our attention now, perhaps, to this article that I actually wrote and published a number of years ago, but I think it's certainly still relevant. And this is an article in the journal People and Strategy, and the title is "High Reliability HR: Preparing the Enterprise for Catastrophes." And we'll post a link to that in the show notes, of course. And what I tried to do in this article was using that large scale university exercise for active shooter events. I did some research along with that, and then tried to use some of the lessons from that to suggest maybe here's some things that are relevant for the function of HR. And what's interesting is that when I was going through the publication process, I received some feedback from some reviewers who said, I'm not sure if this is really what HR does. And my point was, yeah, I know, right? This isn't how HR oftentimes thinks, but HR functions should perhaps think in these different ways. So it was meant to be a little bit, divergent thinking from the status quo of how we oftentimes approach HR. And so, based upon kind of what happened and what I saw and what oftentimes happens in these active shooter events, I looked at these different characteristics of what we call high reliability and how these might relate to what HR does. So, maybe we can just go through a couple of these, and talk about the role of HR in a potential prevention of an active shooter scenario. And the first thing that high reliability organizations do, and high reliability organizations are those that deal with a lot of advanced technology. We would expect them to have more accidents than they do. So, for example, naval aircraft carriers, nuclear power plants, those are the kind of the oftentimes off-cited examples. But the first thing that they do is they have a preoccupation with failure, right? They have a healthy sense of exactly what types of hazards, threats, and vulnerabilities are out there, and they're mindful of them. So, with regard to HR, some things that you could do, systematically review those possibilities, have some scenario based planning and training, and communicate that throughout the organization. HR absolutely could be a huge part of that.
Yeah, I this idea where HR is like, okay, we got 50 employees, we're going to get a breastfeeding room, and okay, we did this so we don't get sued, and oh, look, we got the 1099 documents filled out correctly, and then with anything, and these are the same HR professionals that are saying, God, I'm just not challenged in my job. And
Yeah.
like, there is a huge swath of opportunity for you to start punting your value up at the strategic level, right? So, getting involved and saying like, hey, we need active shooter plans and measurements and these kinds of things.
That's right.
That is your case. Hey, you know what? And it's not just that we need some physical security measures here and that stuff. Now, HR, sometimes, buildings, this will fall more to, say, building security
Sure.
and enterprise level organizations. That's fine. But for a lot of organizations, fire drills, accountability, these kinds of things kind of fall under your purview.
And even if they don't fall directly under your purview as an HR function, HR can function as the connective tissue for these different stakeholders within the organization, bringing them together, facilitating the conversation. So we talked about this idea
And if
of
you can't keep your humans alive, you have no resources, right? I mean, you gotta if you care for your people, you
right.
can't have your annual performance reviews if everybody's shot up because you were asleep at the wheel here.
So, we talked about this idea of preoccupation with failure. Another hallmark of high reliability organizations is a reluctance to simplify interpretation. So, this is, kind of resisting that urge, that pressure that we have to clearly see things as being, cause and effect relationships, and instead trying to seek holistic perspectives on a situation. So, with that being said, there are a few things that HR departments perhaps could promote here. What are some of those, Chris?
Yeah, so one of the things you want to do is like train on what they call root cause analysis. And that's just like, hey, what caused all this stuff to go? So, some of the stuff you can do is just look at what makes somebody more prone to be one of these things and
Mm,
having some training around that kind of stuff. And then another thing is when you do your drills, which you should have an after action review. Hey, what went well? What didn't go so well? Things we should keep doing, things we should probably not do.
yeah, that's great. Another thing that HR could do with regard to this idea is they could develop leaders who support and expect and reward a climate in the organization of healthy questioning. Right? You want people to say, "Hey, this happened and this doesn't look right," or perhaps we should do some more training on this, and having that be met with acceptance and appreciation versus resistance. That's another helpful thing that you can do.
Yeah, and this isn't just for active shooter stuff. This is for anything in your organization, having a
Yeah.
climate that allows that kind of learning and improvement. And this is the thing, having more than one lens for problem solving. And you know where I see this really biting orgs are they have this idea of the thinker versus the doer, right? I'm the manager, I think up the plans, you're the, minions, you do the plans. Well, when it comes to being a high reliability organization, one that can learn, thrive, and adapt in the face of these kinds of situations or even business challenges, firing on all the cylinders of your organizations, everybody being a part of that thinking process and problem solving is important. And here's the thing, there's no silver bullet. And I see people use the silver bullet thing to shut down conversation.
Mm,
Well, there's not one thing that'll get it. Or, well, this isn't a perfect solution. Well, an imperfect plan or something that gives you some modicum of chance is better than just nothing.
that's right. That's right. So the next one is what we call sensitivity to operations, and this is about making sure you have close connections between leaders and those who are most likely to first notice or some sort of subtle sign of an emerging threat, or and also promoting that culture of continual feedback. And so, a few things that HR could do here is really helping your managers be good managers, right? That they're promoting these positive employee relations, that they are rewarding and recognizing people who rapidly report things that are going wrong, either small errors or potential risks and hazards, and really having that healthy, frequent two-way feedback conversations occurring between supervisors and employees. That's going to help the organization overall be more in tune with what's going on and what it should be doing to be ready for these types of events. And it also ties back to that idea that, hey, we're also probably promoting a much healthier culture and climate this way as well.
Right. And don't just leave your managers out to do this for their minions. You need to be obsessing your managers because those are the guys that curate the culture. And if they're creating toxic cultures, this is where you have this when we've all seen those psychopath managers. And maybe they drive some results or they've got some in with the CEO or whatever it is. Watch out because those guys can curate that exact climate that you don't want that leads to these, really bad outcomes.
That's right. So the next one is commitment to resilience, right? So helping to cultivate some knowledge and skill throughout the organization regarding those first responses and some of the things you may need to do afterwards to do when a threat emerges. So certainly HR's got to be involved with training people on these items. I think, just have your HR folks listen to this episode or take a look at that article from the Department of Homeland Security, as well as the article that we're referencing right now. Run, hide, fight should be something that HR is helping to promote and being systematic about delivering that training and perhaps even doing some simulations and exercises to that effect.
Yeah, most people don't even know the term run, hide, fight, but everybody
Hmm,
knows stop, drop, and roll, right? If you're on
that's true.
fire, don't just run. So this needs to be as common as that, at least in a society like ours that's just, there's guns freaking everywhere, right?
At least in the United States, right? So our international listeners are probably thinking, "Oh gosh, you crazy Americans." Well, obviously this can't happen anywhere, right? There have been incidents that have happened outside of the United States, and yeah, we probably have more guns here, but it's certainly something that's of use everywhere. The last one is what we call a deference to expertise, and this is about pushing decision-making authority to the subject matter experts instead of just relying on hierarchy or rank. So, hire those people who are, have those areas of expertise you need, develop skill and knowledge among your key employees, and establish some of those decision making principles that value expertise over rank. And that's helpful with regard to any type of, risk mitigation or helping an organization avoid catastrophe. Because if you have that cultural mindset of, hey, we're going to let those people who have the most expertise make decisions, then you're going to have more luck in catching small errors before they become big ones, and that's the key here, to really making sure that you don't have a catastrophe in your organization. There are a couple other things that maybe we could go through, just some primary lessons and some supplementary lessons from this article that I wrote a few years ago. And you'll find these if you're so inclined. You'll find them on page 37 of the article. And so, one of the primary lessons here is that HR leaders really need to be at the forefront of publicizing those basic procedures.
Yeah, you got to socialize these things. And then you can't just publish them. You need to train people on the roles and responsibilities for these types of incidents. And you know what's cool about all this stuff is by going through this exercise with this, you're going to actually reap benefits and the broader behavioral and operational capabilities of your orgs because people start to have that learning and look for the improvement mindset that they can take to other places. I mean, it's just great.
Yeah, no, that's great. Another thing you should do is certainly share and build upon the existing knowledge. So maybe there's some sort of new technologies or other ways of dealing with this that emerge. Definitely keep that as part of your mindset. Another thing that you need to do is just anticipating change and having this mindset of vigilance. And it's not fun with regard to these types of scenarios. We get it. But having some of that vigilance is very important and can be helpful and certainly even save lives in a situation like this.
Yeah, and so you get gung ho. You hear this episode, and you're rah rah ree. Let's do it in my org, and you have plans. You maybe even do an exercise.
Hmm.
Um, but then you put that stuff in a binder, and maybe the HR director takes another job, and it changes out, and it just grows dust. And people, it's not even probably worth going through it the first time if you don't kind of systematically update that training, maybe make it an annual event similar to fire drills and that kind of stuff, and then budget for some either, training simulations or some time to at least talk and go over what the existing plan is and maybe update it if needed.
That's right. We had a really interesting finding from the research that I did that supports this article, from this large scale training exercise that was held on a university campus where we asked via surveys, about people's, their optimism about their group's abilities and their ability to work with other people. Long story short is that, you've got to have some good cross-functional collaboration within your organization for a whole host of reasons, right? It's helpful for idea sharing, breaking down those silos, but it's also helpful in emergencies, right? If I have worked with maybe somebody from another department or something before, and that's a norm within my organization, then I start to have more trust. And if something actually happens, an emergency of some sort, a crisis, guess what? We're going to be able to work better together in that scenario. And so cross-functional collaboration, always a good thing. And I think the last thing that I would certainly recommend to HR folks out there is, facilitate that collaboration with some of your partner organizations. And maybe this is someone in HR doing it. Maybe it's someone else. You might be working with somebody in business continuity, someone in your security department, someone in your facilities department. But work with those local law enforcement folks to provide them with some contingency plans, especially if you're a large organization, right? With a big campus. Help that collaboration flow so that you can get the best knowledge from them, and so they know what your contingency plans are.
Yeah, and if you're in a big one of these high-rise buildings with, maybe you are the bigger org and you have 8 of the 10 floors, you might reach out to those organizations that are in those other 2 floors and invite them to join your drill, right? So it's a building effort rather than just your single org effort. Those are some things that you kind of want to look at. So Ben, bring us on home. What we talked about today?
So this was a tough topic today. Not quite a fun topic, but a very important topic. We talked about active shooters at work. We talked about this importance of the idea of run, hide, and fight. We talked about some other things. We talked about what active shooters are, what you should do in those situations. We talked about some roles for leaders and managers, and we talked about some considerations for HR departments and the rest of the organization in helping the organization to minimize the probability of some sort of catastrophe. Thanks for listening to the Indigo Podcast. If you like this podcast, please consider helping us by rating us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen, telling your friends about us, having us on your podcast, or mentioning us on social media. Our website is www.indigopodcast.com, where you can access more information about us and this episode. Thanks again, and we look forward to talking with you again soon.